Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum for this Sunday, March the 3rd. In fact, I want to welcome you back to the Sunday Forum. We've been doing special table talk editions for the last, 9 months, where we could talk about issues together but separately in our own families. Well, this topic for this Sunday, we're preparing for a conversation in the Media Center, and this video is a preparation for that conversation again after our worship service. We begin at 10:15. And we thought we would start with a controversial topic, because that's what we always try to do at the Sunday Forum, talk about things that are actually happening in the papers and in our world or in our country. And so this Sunday we're going to talk about the IVF, in vitro fertilization controversy happening in Alabama, where the court has now considered an embryo, a frozen embryo, to be a child. We'll talk about what's considered IVF. And more importantly, we want to raise up some theological issues. When does life begin? Because the court made their decision because the judges said that life begins at conception. Is that what all Christians say? The judges quoted the Bible in their ruling. What do we think as Lutherans, or what do other Christians feel about that interpretation of the Bible? So, pour yourself a cup of coffee and relax as we go over what the court decided, why they decided it, and then we're going to review the Bible. Does the Bible help us with these modern questions and controversies? The answer is going to be yes. So just get out your cup of coffee, relax, and let's jump in. First, an introduction to what happened in Alabama, things that we've all been watching on TV and reading in the paper. The Alabama Supreme Court recently ruled that frozen embryos can be considered children in the eyes of the law. And so, of course, this raises concerns about how the decision could affect in vitro fertilization, commonly known as IVF, among other things, right? Now, to put this in context, about 1 to 2% of all births in the United States last year used this method of IVF. And that would count for about 80,000 births last year. In fact, since this method was started many years ago, the estimation is there has been over 8 million such births using this technique, IVF, in the world. So 2% of all births. This is a big deal, and it touches many women, and it touches many families. So when the courts made this ruling a couple weeks ago, immediately the University of Alabama Hospital, they paused their IVF treatments because they needed to consider what the legal ramifications and the significance of the ruling would be for what they did in the hospital. And other hospitals there in Alabama followed suit. So all these families, even who had started these processes, were now put on hold. What does it mean for IVF, its use? What does it mean when you're storing embryos, let's say, in a freezer? Are you, in essence, storing a child legally before the law? And what does this even mean as far as the practice of abortion? So it's raised up huge issues, but especially the ones we want to talk about is, when does human life begin? Does the Bible give us any hints about that? Because answering that question will go a long way into helping us address these issues or thinking them through ourselves. But just a quick word about IVF. In vitro fertilization offers a possible solution, as many of us know, for when a woman has trouble getting pregnant. It involves retrieving her eggs and combining them in a lab dish with a man's sperm. And they do this to create a fertilized embryo, which is then transferred back into the woman's uterus in an attempt to create pregnancy. Now, IVF is difficult, especially if anyone in your circle of friends has tried it. It often doesn't work the first time. So you need to fertilize many eggs, and often it takes multiple eggs then to finally create a pregnancy, but that also means that some of the eggs then are discarded or stored afterward in a safe location. All right. This has raised up all sorts of opinions. It's a very emotional topic and one that goes to the heart of the biblical story about creation. Some, here are kind of the extremes, some say, I agree with the ruling from Alabama because if an embryo, if it works and you create an embryo and then the embryo dies, that means human life has died. And so if you mishandle that, for example, as a clinician, you've committed murder. That's the way some speak. And others, take a look at the picture here, says in Alabama, this egg is a child. Kind of humorous, but you can see the extremes and the emotions involved. So, of course, here at the Sunday Forum, we can't resolve all these issues just in a few minutes. However, we do want to raise up this issue of when does human life begin? And we're going to show a video that we put together over a year and a half ago in the summer of 2022, which raises up how the Bible speaks about these things, what theology can teach us, and even what we can learn from church history. So when does human life begin? Let's watch this 10-minute clip. We want to bring the Bible into the conversation, okay? And I want you just to buckle up for this, because I read one prominent Bible preacher who said the Bible doesn't speak to the issue of abortion, and I think it does, and completely gives us resources. And the first, I would say, is Genesis. We go back to that creation account, and there's two issues here I want you to pay attention to. The first is, the issue in creation is not about life, it's about human life. When God forms the animals, he creates life. But God doesn't breathe into their nostrils the breath of life, this divine spark, which we would call the soul, the thing that makes us the image of God. That's God breathing in to Adam and making that lump of clay into something just lower than God in God's self. And so the first thing is we have an image because God has breathed into us. And so often, especially the Jewish community, the human soul comes in when you take the first breath. You're not really a human being until the baby is born. You slap his butt or whatever you do now with modern techniques, and that child just takes a breath and becomes a human soul. Now, the second part is when God says to Adam and Eve, I'm giving you dominion over all things. And I've wondered about what that dominion means in reference to life and death issues, especially with children, or having contraception, controlling the amount of children we have and the type of families that we have. I believe we've been given dominion. The question is, before God, how do we use that dominion in ways that promote human flourishing? But we also have the Ten Commandments, right? And often it's just, thou shalt not kill, which is quoted, probably more accurately, thou shalt not murder. But what's important about that is not just that we don't, the negative side, don't murder, but also what Luther says in his explanation to the creed, or to the commandment, where he says, it's not just that we don't murder, there's a positive side, that we take care of the neighbor in all their bodily and physical needs. So again, I think rightly understanding the Ten Commandments says don't kill, but also provide the framework and support for a mother and child. Again, unborn and born. Secondly, though, in Exodus 21, we do have laws that Moses gives, which distinguishes a woman's life from the life of the fetus or the embryo. And so if someone attacks a woman, if she lives, but the embryo dies, or the fetus, they only have to negotiate compensation for the loss of the child, loss of the unborn child. But if she dies in that attack, the attacker is put to death. And so the Jewish law distinguishes legally. It says both are important, both are valued, but they're valued differently. The fetus and the life of the woman. And in Numbers 5, we have an abortion pill. Okay? I couldn't believe this when I read this story of Numbers 5. The story's about a jealous man who thinks his wife has been unfaithful. He goes to the priest in the temple, complains about his wife, and the priest puts together this abortion pill that he takes, which is like this bitter water. It's probably got some herbs in it, and it's got some of the dirt from the ground of the temple, and it gives it to the woman, and it says in the text, it's meant to drop her uterus. It's meant so that she will have a miscarriage, so to speak, that the man doesn't have to take responsibility for caring for the progeny of some other man. And what makes this text weirder, any jealous man can do the same thing, even if he hasn't suspected his wife of being unfaithful. All right, there's more there that I want to discuss in this, but here you've got actually the priest giving the abortion pill with a curse, with a prayer, saying, God, this is what we're hoping for here, so this man doesn't have to carry the responsibility for a child that is not his own. So the Bible does speak to these issues, and so does church history. And here's a shout out to my daughter. When I was presenting her some of these matters and giving her opinion and feedback, she said, well, Dad, you got to share something about church history. Church history really is important here. And I went, I don't know if we have time for all this. She said, you have to. So, okay, I'm doing this for my daughter, but it's also really interesting. Remember, abortions go back to the children of Israel in Egypt with Pharaoh. Again, his interest was not human flourishing, but rather to control the number of slaves because he was afraid they would take power over the Egyptians. And so he asked then these Hebrew midwives to abort all male fetuses. Now, they disobeyed that order. But their abortion was basically a state technique to control the slave population. And this often happens in states when they gain the control. They use it for state purposes rather than for human flourishing. We see that in China with the one-child policy. But we also saw that in Rome and Greek. Rome and Greece both promoted abortions sometimes and were against them other times. But mostly in the pagan world, it was amoral. You could do it if you wanted to. We have Aristotle, who was pro-abortion because he was worried about overpopulation. And at the time of Jesus, we have Augustus Caesar, who was anti-abortion because he wanted more Roman citizens to be born, and he accused the Romans of lacking all morals for not having more children. By and large, though, the pagan world was willing not only to have abortions, but to practice infanticide. And there's where the church came in to defend. They said, well, your gods promote that. Your gods even eat their own young, where the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was the creator of the world and values the creation, made us in the image of God. And so in the early church, they were very much opposed to abortion. In the Didache, one of the most famous texts, it says, thou shalt not murder a child by abortion, nor kill him when born. That's in Didache 2, verse 2. Pretty clear. Now that changes in the medieval church and after the Reformation. And so here you have Christians bringing in other resources, bringing in other Bible texts, and bringing in other theologies. But one of the key questions was, when does a human being become a human being? Now, what do you think? Actually, there are 3 answers. You wish it was simple, but it's 3 answers. And the one you hear, especially promoted by the Roman Catholic Church, is life begins at conception. Right? Right when the sperm and the egg connect and start sharing DNA, that is when human life begins. So that's one answer. The second really comes also from church history, from Thomas Aquinas, who went all the way back to Aristotle. And he felt really what made a human is when the human has a soul. And Thomas Aquinas felt that there was a later ensoulment, often called quickening. And so you maybe heard that phrase, that all of a sudden the baby starts moving in the womb and the woman starts getting excited because now it's acting like a baby inside of her. It reacts to even song and music and the human voice. They say, that's when the soul enters that fetus. But then we just read Genesis, where it was that first breath of life. And that's when the child becomes independent of the mother, takes that first breath, and then receives the human soul. Is there any consensus? Is it conception? Is it the late ensoulment in the second, third trimester? Or is it the breath of life when the child leaves the womb? Is there an answer, a right answer? No. I wish there was consensus, but there's not. And so we try to come up with biological answers. We try a little bit of theology like natural law. Natural law says, first of all, that humans are built with a certain moral instinct in our gut, in our hearts. And we understand this, right? If you're on a boat and the boat's starting to sink, somebody gets up and says what? Save the women and children, right? We have that instinct that the future of life is wrapped up with women and children. That's that instinct of natural law, and it is pro-life. So in this regard, we're all pro-life. We're all trying to guard, especially women in particular, because they're such a source of life, and that's in our instinct. But others would add, we're also self-preservation is part of natural law. And we realize this when, for example, we're attacked, we defend ourselves, even to the point of war. And some would say, is war evil? We say, yes, war is evil. But sometimes we conduct the evilness of war to preserve ourselves, to defend our quality of life, to defend ourselves when we're under attack. And so we do evil things because that's also part of our gut instincts. You might say part of the moral law. Finally, vocation. Who's called to make the decision? And I mean that in a theological sense. When God creates, God gives instructions. He gives a call to have dominion. And so this idea of dominion forces us to say, who has been given the call, so to speak, to make these weighty decisions? Once again, just a reminder, is it the woman, the wider community, or the state? Oh, I don't know about you, but I could take another cup of coffee. That was just a lot of information. And I want you again to get that second cup of coffee and just think about what you've heard. It's a lot of information. And you want to just review it in your head, because then in a moment we want to put our coffee cups down and we want to say, okay, are there any final thoughts that would help us in our discussion? Because we want to bring all these ideas, these insights, remember our personal stories, and now our reactions to all this other information to inform our moral judgments as communities and individuals. We want to bring that all to the Sunday Forum again at 10:15 and share that with one another. So, enjoy your second cup of coffee.
Let's go out to the kitchen. Let's go out to the kitchen. Let's go out to the kitchen and have ourselves a snack.
Okay, as you see, these issues are not simple, and the Bible doesn't give always simple answers to any of the big questions, whether it's about abortion itself or when life begins. And so again, pour your second cup of coffee and let's see how we can frame the conversation for the Media Center at 10:15 on Sunday. So here we have two poles of the discussion. On the one hand are Roman Catholics, and the other hand, I would say, is science and the Enlightenment. On the one hand, the Roman Catholic side, we're really talking about the clergy and not Roman Catholics, because as we know, Roman Catholic women, well, they act a lot like Protestant women. They have all sorts of practices when it comes to abortion or IVF. But the official position for Roman Catholics, clergy, is that sex always happens within marriage, and is always targeted to procreation. In fact, you'll hear that from priests. You're not even allowed to have pleasure during sex. It's supposed to not be for pleasure, but God created the union to create children. And because of that, there is no IVF, because it's against God's will. It's not taking place within the act of intercourse. Also, life begins then at conception. And they'll quote then that this fertilized embryo is actually a child. It's human life. And therefore, any act against it is murder. And they'll refer to the Bible, especially the idea of the image of God. Even the embryo is image of God. Okay, that's the one side. On the other side, you have science and the Enlightenment, which is a lot more pragmatic. This is carried out, let's say, in the decision of Roe versus Wade. And here we say a woman has rights over her body and her ability to build her own family, or not, depending on how she decides. So then that means yes to abortion and yes to IVF. Very pragmatic. Here the decision is that human life doesn't begin at conception. It begins, some will use the term quickening, right there at the third trimester, into the second trimester, when all of a sudden the child moves. Even the philosopher Aristotle would talk about the soul entering the body at the quickening, or possibly even at birth. And so here also, if you're a Christian but you follow the Enlightenment science, you might say we also refer to the Bible because God in creation gave us dominion over all things. We're just exercising our dominion in ways that help a woman and which help the family. So here are two extremes: Roman Catholic on one side, no, no, no. On the other side, science and the Enlightenment, yes, yes, yes. Both, if you're a Christian, will refer to the Bible, and Protestants are often right there in the middle. And you'll see some Protestants saying yes to some things like abortion, but no to other things like, or no to abortion and yes to IVF, or they swing back and forth because Protestants, like Lutherans, have often talked about the freedom of a Christian, that God has given us freedom to make decisions. And so that's what we want to talk about here on the Sunday Forum. When does human life begin? How do you read the Bible? And then in answering that, when does human life receive the soul? And how does that influence your opinion toward the practice of IVF? All right, bring your coffee to the Media Center on 1015 as we discuss this very important topic. Thanks for joining us on the Sunday Forum. Bye-bye now.